Caldwell Rusk didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Bell Ranch house swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and he walked in like the place already had his name on it. Mara Bell stood at the kitchen table, her hands still dusted with flour, and she didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened so hard she felt the ache of it in her back teeth. "You missed the payment window," Caldwell said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table, her late husband Thomas's chair, and sitting down in it without asking. He set his hat on the table like he owned the surface beneath it. "Lease board meets in 6 weeks. You don't have crew, you don't have cattle numbers, and you don't have a man running this property." He looked her straight in the eye, and something ugly moved behind his smile. "What you have, Mara, is a problem." She looked at the chair, at him sitting in it. She thought about Thomas, who had died in March with mud on his boots and a cough that turned into something that took him in 11 days flat. "Get out of my house," she said. Caldwell picked up a biscuit from the cloth on the counter, without asking, and took a bite. "You'll lose this lease. We both know it. I'm offering you a way out that doesn't end with you standing in the dirt watching strangers inventory your stock. If that image doesn't reach down into something primal in your chest, a man eating from your kitchen, sitting in your dead husband's chair telling you that your home is already his, then you've never had anything worth fighting for. Mara Bell had. And she wasn't done fighting yet. If this kind of story grabs you, stories about women who refuse to fold, about loyalty tested by hard land and harder people, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this one all the way through. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, leave a like. It tells me you're out there. Now, let's go back to the beginning. E.P. The morning Thomas Bell died, Mara burned the cornbread. She didn't notice until the smoke reached the bedroom, where she was sitting beside him with her hand over his and listening to his breathing go shallow and strange. By the time she got to the kitchen, the pan was black on the bottom and the smell had soaked into the curtains. She scraped it into the yard, set the pan on the porch rail, and went back inside. She didn't cry until 2 days after the burial, alone in the barn, with her face pressed into the neck of Thomas's old quarter horse. The horse stood still and let her. That was March. By May, 3 of her 4 hired hands had quit. Not because they didn't respect her. 2 of them had the decency to look ashamed when they left. But Bell Ranch had been running lean since the previous fall. Cattle numbers down, calves missing from the south pasture, and a dry winter that had cracked 2 of the water troughs along the fence line. Without Thomas to work the relationships in town, to press palms and buy rounds at the feed store, the ranch felt like something slowly losing pressure. The one hand who stayed was a weathered man named Decker, who was 63 years old and walked with a hitch in his left leg from an old horse kick. He was loyal in the way of old men who didn't have any place better to go, and Mara was grateful for him in a way she couldn't always put into words. "You ought to post something at the feed store," Decker told her one afternoon, leaning on the fence rail while she counted the remaining calves in the south pen. "Maybe the Garrett brothers are looking for work." "The Garrett brothers drink." "Well," he scratched his chin. "Everybody's got something." She posted a notice anyway. 3 words. Rancher wanted. Bell. She didn't expect much. What she got 2 weeks later was Caldwell Rusk in her kitchen. He hadn't come in response to the notice. He'd come because Caldwell Rusk monitored opportunity the way other men monitored weather. He had watched Thomas Bell weaken through the winter. He had watched the ranch hands leave. He had been watching Bell Ranch the way a crow watches a fence post, patient, still, waiting for something to stop moving. Caldwell ran the largest cattle operation in the county, 20 miles east, and his property butted up against the south boundary of Bell Land at a stretch of canyon country that everyone in the valley knew was worth something, though nobody had ever quite agreed on what. Thomas had refused to sell that strip of land twice. The second refusal had put a permanent frost between the 2 men that never thawed. "I'm not here to fight you, son," Caldwell told Mara, still sitting in Thomas's chair like he'd been invited. "I'm here because I'm a practical man. You're a practical woman. Let's talk about what makes sense." "What makes sense," Mara said, "is you leaving before I get less polite about it." He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had never really been told no and had learned to hear it as a temporary condition. "The lease board won't renew to a single woman without proven crew and cattle numbers. That's not me saying that. That's the board. Then I'll get crew and cattle numbers. In 6 weeks. She didn't answer that because he wasn't entirely wrong, and they both knew it. Caldwell stood, finally, and picked up his hat from the table. He was a big man, not fat, but built heavy in the shoulders in a way that made rooms feel smaller. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame, not turning around. "I'll take the South Canyon strip off the lease terms," he said. "Make you a fair offer on the rest of the land, and you can keep the house as part of the deal. You'd have money. You'd have a roof. You wouldn't have to fight a board that's already decided. Goodbye, Mr. Rusk." He left, but the door didn't close all the way on the latch, and Mara had to cross the room and push it shut herself, which felt like the smallest possible indignity, except that it wasn't small at all. She stood at the closed door for a moment, one hand still on the wood. Then she went back to counting calves. The notice at the feed store sat for another week without a response. Mara worked the ranch with Decker, pushing through the daily work of it, feeding, checking water lines, moving the remaining cattle between pastures to keep them off the thin grass. She fixed a section of fence herself on a Tuesday morning, her hands blistering in 2 places before she switched to different gloves. Her back hurt, her shoulders hurt. She slept hard and woke before dawn and did it again. She didn't let herself think too far forward. Forward was where the lease hearing lived, and the lease board, and Caldwell Rusk and his careful smile. She stayed in the present tense, which was fence posts and water troughs, and the particular smell of early summer on high desert land. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the wagon came up the drive. Mara was in the yard near the barn, replacing a hinge on the gate, when she heard it. She straightened up and shaded her eyes with her forearm. The wagon was simple. 1 horse, a working rig, not fancy. The man driving it was lean and quiet-looking, maybe 35, with the kind of sun-darkened face that came from years of outdoor work rather than one bad summer. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the gate and climbed down without hurry. She noticed the child a beat later. The girl was maybe 8 or 9, slight, with dark braids that had come half loose from their ties. She was pressed against the side of the wagon seat with her face turned slightly away, as if she was trying to be less visible without actually hiding. When the man climbed down, she didn't follow. She just watched. The man walked to the gate and stopped a respectful distance back, which Mara noticed. "Maribel Bell?" he said. "Who's asking?" "Gideon Hale." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the notice from the feed store. He held it out toward her. "I was told you need a rancher." She looked at the paper. She looked at him. He was holding his hat in one hand and the paper in the other, standing straight but not stiff, with the quality of someone who was used to being evaluated and had learned not to perform for it. "You got references?" she said. 3. 2 in Mercer County, 1 in Dalton Springs. All long-term employment. "Why'd you leave Dalton Springs?" He held her look. "My wife died. I needed somewhere new." Mara's eyes moved to the wagon. The girl had turned to look now, full face, with large, dark eyes that were watchful in a way that didn't quite fit her age. She was holding something, small, something she pressed between both palms. "That your daughter?" "June." His voice changed slightly on the name, not softer exactly, but more careful. "She travels with me. She won't be underfoot. She's quiet." "She doesn't look quiet. She looks like she's thinking a lot." Something moved across his face at that. It might have been surprise or relief or something more complicated than either. "Yes," he said. "That's a fair way to put it." Mara set down her pliers and walked to the wagon. The girl, June, watched her come without retreating. Up close, Mara could see what she was holding, a piece of burned wood, smooth-edged, about the size of a playing card. Cedar maybe, though it was hard to tell from the char. The girl's hands were wrapped around it like it was something she'd had for a long time. "What's that?" Mara asked. June looked at her. Then she looked down at the wood piece. She didn't answer. "She doesn't talk much," Gideon said from behind Mara. "Not apologetic, just factual. Not since her mother." Mara looked at the piece of charred wood for another moment. Then she looked back at Gideon. "References are no good to me right now," she said. "I can't ride to Mercer County to check them. You know that as well as I do. So here's what I can offer. 2 weeks trial, room and board in the bunkhouse, and if you can prove you know what you're doing in 2 weeks, we'll talk wages and a proper contract. Gideon nodded. That's fair. There's no partnership deal here. No ownership, no percentage. No deal that puts your name on anything. You work for me. I'm the one who owns this lease. That going to be a problem? No. She watched him. Most men would push back on that. I'm not most men. She wasn't sure yet whether that was true or just something he said, but she'd run out of options about 3 weeks ago, and standing in her yard with a broken gate hinge in one hand and bad knees was no way to fight a lease board. She looked at June one more time. The girl was still watching her, dark eyes steady. There's a room in the bunkhouse with a real door, Mara said. Your daughter can have it. The cot's decent. June blinked. It was the closest thing to a reaction Mara had seen from her. Thank you, Gideon said. Don't thank me yet. Work starts at 5. Bam. He did know what he was doing. That was apparent within the first 48 hours. Gideon worked without being told twice, without being told at all in most cases. He moved through the ranch with the quiet attentiveness of someone reading a place, the way a good doctor reads a patient, taking in what was broken and what was compensating for what was broken and what was broken so long nobody'd remembered it wasn't supposed to be that way. The second water trough, the one along the east fence line, had a crack that had been plugged with a cloth rag stuffed into the split. He pulled the rag out, looked at the trough, looked at Decker, and said, How long has this been patched like this? Decker scratched his neck. Thomas did that, I think, last fall maybe. Cattle drinking gray water? It's not, Decker started, then stopped. The cloth's been there a while. Gideon didn't say anything judgmental. He went to the wagon, found the right materials, and had the trough sealed properly by mid-afternoon. Mara watched from a distance without making her watching obvious, which was something she'd gotten good at after years of managing a husband who didn't like being observed too carefully. She noticed Gideon didn't oversell himself, didn't come to her at the end of the day with a list of what he'd accomplished. He just showed up at supper, ate what was put in front of him, said very little, and went back to the bunkhouse. June stayed close to him during the day, trailing at a distance that varied depending on what he was doing, closer when he was still, further when he was working with the horses. On the third day, Mara came around the corner of the barn and nearly walked into the girl. June was standing just outside the barn door, holding that piece of burned wood in both hands and staring at the brand rack mounted on the barn's east wall. The rack held the Bell brand irons, the tools they used to mark cattle, each iron bearing the distinctive bell mark that Thomas had designed himself 20 years ago. It was a simple design, a bell shape with a single horizontal bar beneath it. June was staring at it with an intensity that was a little unsettling in a child her age. You know what those are? Mara asked. June looked at her, then back at the rack. She held up the burned wood piece, the char pattern on one edge of it. Mara hadn't looked at it closely before. But now, in the right angle of morning light, she could see it wasn't just random burn damage. There was a shape in it, a curved line, not quite a brand mark, but close to the shape of one. Something cold moved along Mara's arms that had nothing to do with the morning air. Where did you get that? She asked, more quietly. June's hands tightened around the piece. She didn't answer. June. Mara crouched down so she was at the girl's eye level, which put some stress on her knees she didn't entirely appreciate. I'm not going to take it. I just want to know where it came from. The girl looked at her for a long moment with those dark, thinking eyes. Then she looked back at the brand rack, then back at Mara. She took one small step toward the barn and pointed inside, toward the south wall. Mara straightened up and followed her gaze. There was nothing on the south wall except old harness hooks and a water stain from a leak that had been there longer than Mara had. But June was pointing with certainty. I don't see anything, Mara said. June looked at her one more time. Then she turned and walked away, back toward the bunkhouse, the burned cedar piece pressed against her chest. Mara stood in front of the barn and felt the cold thing spread a little further across her shoulders. Decker found her in the kitchen that evening. That Hale fellow fixed the feed line on the north pen, he said, pouring himself coffee. And he asked me about the south pasture calves. What about them? How many we lost last fall? I told him 12, maybe 13. He got a look on his face. Mara looked up from the table. What kind of look? Like that number meant something to him. Decker sat down. He asked if we'd ever found any sign of them, bones, hide, anything. I told him no, they just weren't there one morning. He didn't say anything after that, just kept working. Mara was quiet. You told him Thomas's take on it? She asked. Thomas thought it was a predator, mountain cat, maybe a loose pack. 12 calves is a lot for a mountain cat. I said the same thing to Thomas at the time. Decker wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He didn't want to hear it. Said if it was rustling, the sheriff would have to get involved, and he didn't want that kind of trouble when the lease was already complicated. Mara sat with that for a moment. Outside, the evening had gone dark blue and still, and she could hear Gideon moving in the barn. The sound of tools, deliberate and unhurried. Thomas might have been wrong, she said. It was the first time she'd said that out loud about anything, and it cost her something. Decker just nodded. Most men are, about most things, at least some of the time. Doesn't mean he wasn't a good man. No, Mara said. It doesn't. She got up and went to the window. In the fading light, she could just make out the figure of June sitting on the bunkhouse steps, the burned cedar piece in her lap, turning it over and over in her hands. The trouble started the following Monday, when Caldwell Rusk came back. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man named Pryor, who worked for him as a sort of overseer, and a third man Mara didn't recognize, who had the careful look of someone whose job was to watch and remember. They rode up to the ranch yard mid-morning when Mara was moving cattle from the south pen to the middle pasture with Decker. Gideon was at the far end of the fence line, replacing posts when they arrived. He saw them. He stopped what he was doing but didn't approach. Caldwell dismounted and stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and looked around the ranch with an expression that managed to be both casual and calculated. You got someone working the fence, he said when Mara reached him. I do. Hired hand? That's right. Caldwell turned to look at Gideon, who had gone back to working the fence post and was paying them no obvious attention. Drifter? Rancher, Mara said. From Mercer County. Caldwell smiled a little. Funny how they just show up. He looked at Mara. You putting together a crew? 6 weeks is not a lot of time. It's enough. To bring your cattle numbers back up? To show the lease board a functioning operation? He said it gently, like he was worried about her, and the gentleness was worse than the hard version would have been. Mara, I'm not trying to kick you when you're down. I'm trying to give you a real choice before you run out of time. I have a choice. I'm making it. Pryor, who had stayed on his horse, was looking toward the barn with a particular kind of attention that Mara didn't like. What is Pryor looking at? She said. Caldwell glanced back at him. Nothing. He's looking at the brand rack. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, very briefly, like a door closed on the other side of a wall. You're getting paranoid, Mara. It's understandable. Grief does strange things to a person's head. You need to leave my property. We're leaving. He put his hat on. But think about what I said. Think about what a fair offer looks like compared to what that lease board is going to hand you if you show up without numbers. He mounted and rode out. Pryor followed. The third man, the watcher, held his horse a moment longer than necessary, and Mara felt his attention like a hand on the back of her neck. Then they were gone. Gideon walked up behind her a few minutes later. She heard him coming and didn't turn around. Who was that? He said. Man named Caldwell Rusk. He runs the eastern operation. He wants this land. Why? She paused. That's a good question. Better question than what I usually ask. She turned around finally. What do you know about that South Canyon strip? The property boundary down past the cut. Gideon was quiet for a second. Then, I haven't been down there yet. What if I told you my husband refused to sell that strip to Rusk twice, and that the calves that went missing last fall were mostly from the south pasture, which runs along the top of the canyon? Gideon looked at her steadily. I'd say that's a lot of things pointing in the same direction. That's what I'd say, too. She looked back toward the road where the dust from Caldwell's horses was still settling. Tomorrow, she said, I want to ride the south boundary. I'll go with you. I didn't invite you. No, he said, but you're going to need someone who knows how to read cut fence and track livestock, and I'm what you've got. He paused. I'll go with you if you want me there. If not, I'll keep working the posts. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not pushing. He was not taking over. He was just standing there in the last of the morning sun, offering a fact. 5 in the morning, she said. Don't make me wait. He nodded and went back to the fence. Behind her, through the bunkhouse window, she could see June sitting at the small table, the burned cedar piece in front of her. She was drawing something on a scrap of paper, lines, shapes, with the focused concentration of a child working out a problem she didn't yet have words for. Mara watched her for a moment. Then she went inside to check the cattle records from last fall, pulling out the ledger Thomas had kept in the bottom drawer of the desk, the one she hadn't been able to open since March without feeling like she was trespassing on something. She opened it now. 12 calves, 13. The numbers were there, in Thomas's careful hand, logged by date and pasture location, all from the south section, all from a 30-day window in October. She flipped back through the pages, looking for anything she might have missed, and near the back of the previous year's ledger, in a margin note she'd never noticed before, Thomas had written 3 words in a hand that was slightly different from his usual, rushed, like he'd been writing fast or in low light. South Canyon, Rusk. Just that. No sentence, no explanation. 2 words that might mean nothing or might mean everything. She set the ledger on the desk and sat with her hands flat on it for a long time. Then she went to check on the cattle because that was the work, and the work didn't stop waiting just because the ground had shifted under your feet. The south boundary fence had been cut in 3 places. Mara saw the first one before Gideon said anything. A clean slice through 2 wires, the ends curled back with a precision that ruled out weather or animal. She pulled her horse up short and sat looking at it in the gray early morning light, and the feeling that moved through her wasn't surprise. It was something closer to the cold satisfaction of suspicion confirmed, which wasn't really satisfaction at all. Gideon had already dismounted by the time she looked over. He crouched beside the cut wire and ran his thumb along the edge without touching the curl. Wire cutters, he said. Good ones. Not a fence tool, something sharper. He stood. Recent. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Ground's not grown back around the posts. Thomas logged the calves gone in October, Mara said. That's 8 months. Then there's been more than one cut. He walked along the line a few yards in each direction, reading the ground in the way of someone who'd spent enough years on open land to know what disturbed earth looked like. There's another one about 40 yards east. She followed him to it. Same clean cut, same careful curl. And near the base of the post, pressed into the soft dirt at the edge of the scrub, a partial boot print that was too large to be hers and too deliberate in its placement to be accidental. The heel was down, toes angled toward the canyon. Someone walked cattle through here, Gideon said. Not chased them, walked them. That takes time and quiet, and somebody who knew when your hands weren't watching. Mara looked down at the canyon. From where they stood, the land dropped into a cut of red rock and cedar scrub, narrowing into a throat of shadow, maybe 200 yards down. The canyon ran south for about a mile before it opened again into a wider basin that technically sat just inside the contested strip of land Thomas had refused to sell. I've never been down into that basin, she said. Gideon looked at her. Why not? Thomas didn't like the footing for horses on the lower trail. He said it wasn't worth the risk. She paused. He also never told me about the note in his ledger, the one that had Rusk's name next to the canyon. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, you want to ride down? She looked at the trail. It was narrow, loose shale in the upper section before it hit a shelf of harder ground, and her horse was good, but not young. Not today. Not the 2 of us alone. He nodded. He didn't push. What I want to do today, she said, is count every head we have. Write it down. Then I want to look at what the lease board is going to ask for and figure out exactly how short we are. I can help with the count. I know you can. She turned her horse back toward the ranch. I also want you to check the 3rd fence section. If there are 2 cuts, there might be a 3rd. Already planning on it. They rode back mostly in silence, which was a different kind of silence than the one on the drive out, less wary. Not comfortable exactly, but not strained. She was aware of him riding a half length behind her to the left, not crowding, giving her the lead without making a thing of it. Thomas used to ride a half length ahead without thinking about it. She'd never said anything. The third fence cut was near the north end of the south boundary, almost hidden behind a stand of juniper that had grown up thick enough to block sight lines from the pasture. Gideon found it on his own, while Mara was inside pulling ledgers, and he came to the back door of the house mid-morning and knocked twice before stepping back, which she also noticed. "Third one's there," he said when she opened the door. "Same method, but this one's older, 6 months, maybe more, and the ground's harder up there. Whatever came through was moved slow and in small groups, not a rush job. So it happened more than once. At least twice that I can read. Probably more." She stood in the doorway and looked past him toward the pastures, where Decker was moving the remaining stock with the focused, unhurried energy of an old man who had decided long ago not to hurry because the work didn't get done any faster that way. 12 calves, she said. 13. That's what Thomas wrote. A bull calf at 6 months is worth real money. Multiply that out. I know what it multiplies out to. She said it harder than she meant to. Then, sorry. Don't be. He shifted his weight slightly. You've been doing the math since you found the ledger. I don't need to do it for you. She looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands again, and she couldn't tell if that was habit or deliberate courtesy. But either way, it was the kind of thing you noticed when you'd spent years watching men stand in doorways, deciding how much of your space they were entitled to. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He hesitated just briefly enough for her to notice. "I don't want to be underfoot." "I said, come in, Hale." He came in. She poured 2 cups and set one on the counter near him, not at the table. That distinction felt important in a way she didn't fully examine. He stayed near the counter and drank the coffee standing up. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why Dalton Springs?" She watched him. "You left Dalton Springs after your wife died. That's what you told me. But Dalton Springs is 3 days' ride from here, and there are ranches along the way that would have taken on a hand with your experience. Why'd you come this far?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned the cup in his hands the way his daughter turned the cedar piece. "June," he said. She wasn't doing well where we were. The house, the people. Everything reminded her. I thought if we got far enough from it, she might start to..." He stopped. "She hasn't really talked since her mother died. 7 months. The doctor said give her time. But she's not getting quieter because she's healing. She's getting quieter because she's deciding the quiet is safer." Mara said nothing. She knew something about deciding the quiet was safer. "I rode through here 3 years ago," Gideon continued, "past Bell Ranch on the main road. I remember thinking it was the kind of place that looked like it had been fought for, not handed down, fought for." He paused. "I saw the notice in Harmon's feed store, and I thought maybe a place someone fought for might be the kind of place that could handle a girl who's still figuring out how to be in the world again." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window toward the bunkhouse. "She was drawing something yesterday evening," Mara said. "At the table in the bunkhouse. Shapes, lines. She draws a lot since her mother." "What does she draw?" He looked at her carefully. "Mostly things she sees, things she's thinking about." He paused. "She's been drawing the brand rack since we arrived." The cold thing moved across Mara's shoulders again. "Go get her," she said. "What?" "Go get June. I want to show her something." She spread the ledger on the kitchen table, opened to the October pages, and set the margin note where June could see it. Then she set the Bell brand iron, the one she'd taken down from the rack that morning, on the table beside it. June stood across the table from her, holding the burned cedar piece, looking at the iron. "That's our brand," Mara said. "Bell Ranch. My husband designed it. It goes on our cattle so everyone knows they're ours." She tapped the margin note without covering Thomas's handwriting. "Your father told me you notice things adults sometimes miss." She met the girl's eyes. "That piece of wood you carry, where did you find it?" June looked at the cedar piece, then at the brand iron. Then, slowly, she set the cedar piece down on the table next to the iron. The burn mark on the edge of the cedar wasn't the Bell brand. Mara had thought it was similar, but up close, side by side, she could see it was different. A rougher mark, less controlled, with a horizontal bar that crossed at the wrong angle. It was the shape of a brand, but not this brand. "Where did you find this?" Mara asked again, more carefully. June picked up the iron and held it beside the cedar piece, lining them up. The burn on the wood was slightly larger than the bell iron's mark. She held them steady and looked at Mara. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the scrap of paper she'd been drawing on the night before. She set it on the table. It was a drawing, rough, childlike in some ways, but spatially careful in the way of someone who paid close attention to proportion. It showed the canyon trail, or something like the canyon trail. Mara recognized the shape of the cut and the shelf of rock, and at the bottom of the drawing, in the widest part of what had to be the basin, were shapes that were clearly meant to be cattle, many of them, crowded together in a space that had walls drawn around it, an enclosure, inside the canyon basin. Gideon, standing behind June, made a very small sound that might have been breath-releasing. "June," he said carefully, "did you go down the canyon trail?" She looked up at him, then she looked at Mara. "She can't have gone down there alone," Mara said. "June," Gideon crouched beside her. When did you go down there?" June held up the cedar piece again, then she pointed at the drawing, at the far left corner, where she'd drawn a small shape that Mara hadn't registered before. It was a structure of some kind, a shed maybe, or a lean-to, and beside it she'd drawn a mark, a brand mark, the same rough mark from the cedar piece, not the Bell brand, a different one. "She went down there," Mara said flatly. "Apparently. By herself." "She wanders," Gideon said, and the word carried the particular exhaustion of a parent who has had this conversation with themselves many times. "I didn't know she'd gone that far. I thought she was in the yard." Mara looked at the drawing, at the shapes that were clearly cattle in an enclosed space inside a canyon basin she'd never bothered to ride into, at a brand mark on a piece of burned cedar that wasn't hers. "I need to go down there," she said. "You said not alone." "I'm not alone. I've got you, and I've got Decker." She was already folding the drawing with care and putting it in her pocket. "Not today. I need to think about this first. I need to think about what happens if I ride down there and find something I can't unfind." Gideon stood. He looked at her steadily. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if Caldwell Rusk has got cattle hidden in that basin, with my brand painted over by his, I have to be careful about how I find them. If I ride down there with just the three of us, and we bring back some calves, he'll say we moved them ourselves. He'll say we planted evidence." She pressed her fingers to the edge of the table. "I need witnesses. I need people from town who don't owe me anything and don't owe him anything." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be harder than riding into the canyon." "I know. Most people in town have probably already written you off." "I know that too." She looked at June. The girl had taken the cedar piece back and was holding it with both hands again, but she was looking at Mara with those big thinking eyes, and there was something in her expression that Mara could only call recognition, like June was watching someone do what needed to be done and understanding it at a level she didn't need words for. "Thank you," Mara said to her. Not for any specific thing, just, "Thank you." June didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The town of Harmon sat 8 miles from Bell Ranch, close enough to ride in a reasonable morning, but far enough to feel separate, which was mostly how Mara preferred it. She'd lived here 9 years since marrying Thomas and moving up from the lower valley, and she knew every business and most of the families. She also knew, in the careful way of women who paid attention, which people had already decided she couldn't hold the ranch, and which people were still waiting to see. She rode into Harmon on a Thursday afternoon, alone, without telling Gideon where she was going. That wasn't entirely fair to him. He had a right to know, given that he was working her fence line with a stated interest in helping, but she needed to do this part herself. The land office was her first stop. The clerk, a young man named Aldous with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had already eaten his lunch, looked up when she came in, and then looked uncertain about his expression. "Mrs. Bell? I need to see the full terms of the Bell Ranch lease, the original filing, and the renewal conditions." He hesitated. "Mr. Rusk was in earlier this week. He asked about the—" "I'm not Mr. Rusk." She set her hands on the counter. "I'm the leaseholder. Those records are mine to review." He got them. She stood at the counter for 20 minutes reading, which was not comfortable and which she did without complaint. The renewal conditions were what Caldwell had described: cattle numbers, crew verification, proof of active operation. But there was a clause near the bottom of the original filing that the clerk apparently hadn't expected her to find, because when she read it twice and looked up, he had the specific look of someone trying not to look like they knew what she'd just found. "This clause," she said, pointing, "contested land within the lease boundary cannot be transferred or subleased without verification of original claim. What does that mean for the South Canyon Strip?" Aldous cleared his throat. "It means the canyon section can't be separately sold or transferred unless the primary leaseholder releases the claim. Which means if I hold the lease, Rusk can't acquire the canyon strip through a separate deal." "That's the simplest reading?" "Yes." "Is there a less simple reading?" He looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Rusk has argued the canyon strip falls outside the active lease boundary because it hasn't been used for cattle operation in over 3 years. And if it turns out cattle have been in that basin recently?" Aldous looked at her for a moment. Then the use argument wouldn't hold. She folded the page she'd been looking at, not removing it, just marking the location with her finger, and looked at him carefully. "Aldous, how long have you worked this office?" 4 years? And in 4 years, how many times has Caldwell Rusk been in here asking questions about Bell Ranch?" The young man opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not sure I should—" "More than twice?" He looked at his desk. "More than twice," he said quietly. She thanked him and left. Her second stop was the feed store, where Harmon Briggs, who owned the building and had known Thomas for 15 years, was in the back arguing with his supplier about a short delivery. She waited. When he came out and saw her, his face did something complicated. "Mara, heard you got someone working the place." "I did. Good man from Mercer County." Harmon leaned on the counter. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of careful eyes that had seen a lot of business done and knew the difference between a deal and a hustle. "You holding up all right?" "I need something from you," she said. Not small talk. She didn't have time. "I need someone in town who the lease board would consider credible to ride out to Bell Ranch in the next few days. Maybe more than one someone." "What for?" "To see something, as a witness." She looked at him. "I can't explain all of it yet. But if what I think is true turns out to be true, I'm going to need people who the board can't say I paid or pressured." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. He stroked the side of his jaw. "You're talking about Rusk." She didn't confirm or deny it. "I'm talking about what's right." "Those aren't always the same thing." "No," she said. "But I'm hoping this time they are." He tapped the counter twice, slowly. "Let me think on who might be willing. Some folks around here they've got business with Rusk's operation. Supply contracts, that kind of thing." "I know." "Give me 2 days." She nodded and started for the door, then she stopped. "Harmon, did Thomas ever say anything to you about the South Canyon?" The old man was very still for a moment. Then, "He asked me once, about 2 winters ago, whether I'd noticed any change in the calves coming through Rusk's sales lots, numbers-wise." "Had you?" "I said I didn't keep track that close." He paused. "I maybe should have looked closer." She held his gaze. 2 days, she said, and walked out. "Yeah." Gideon was replacing the gate hinge, the one she'd been working on herself the day he arrived, when she rode back into the yard. He looked up without stopping what he was doing, which she appreciated. "Where'd you go?" he said. "Town, land office, feed store." He held the hinge in place with one hand and looked at her. "And?" "There's a clause in the lease that protects the canyon strip from separate transfer as long as I hold the primary lease. Rusk has been arguing the strip isn't actively used. If we can show cattle in that basin, the argument falls apart." Gideon turned back to the gate. He worked the bolt through and seated it before he said anything. How soon do you want to ride down there? Not yet. I'm trying to get witnesses from town. She dismounted and tied her horse to the rail. I need people Russ can't discredit. That could take time we might not have. I know. She pulled her gloves off. In the meantime, I want to keep working the ranch like nothing's changed. I don't want Rusk knowing we're looking at the canyon. Gideon tested the gate. It swung clean and latched right for the first time in what was probably a year. He looked at it for a second with the flat expression of someone who'd fixed a lot of things and knew the satisfaction was small. He's going to find out. Eventually, not yet. He's already watching this place. Then we give him nothing to see except a woman running her ranch. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite categorize. Not admiration exactly, more like alignment. The look of someone recognizing a direction they were already heading. All right, wait, he said. That evening, after supper, Mara sat at the desk with Thomas's ledger spread in front of her, trying to build a complete picture of what had gone missing and when. June drifted in from the bunkhouse sometime after dark and sat on the floor near the fireplace without asking, the cedar piece in her hands, watching the low fire. Mara let her stay. They sat like that for an hour without speaking, and it was, Mara thought, one of the less lonely hours she'd had since March. The attack, when it came, was small enough to be dismissed as accident and specific enough to be a message. She found it Thursday morning. The brand rack on the barn's east wall had been pulled from its mounting. Not fallen, pulled, the anchor bolt stripped from the wood in a way that suggested tools rather than weather or impact. The irons were on the ground below, one of them bent at the handle from the fall. The Bell brand iron itself, the original one Thomas had commissioned from the blacksmith in Harmon 20 years ago, had a crack in the shank that might or might not be repairable. And the window on the east side of the house, the kitchen window, the one that faced the yard, had a long fracture across the lower pane, clean and diagonal, as if something had been pressed against it hard from outside. Decker found her standing in front of the barn with the cracked iron in her hands. "Wasn't like that yesterday evening," he said. "No." She turned the iron. The crack went halfway through the shank. "Someone was here in the night." "I didn't hear anything." "Neither did I." She said it without accusation. An old man with a bad leg who slept in the bunkhouse wasn't a night watchman. She'd never expected him to be. "Go check the fence lines. Start with the south section." He went without argument. She carried the cracked iron inside and set it on the kitchen table next to the ledger that was still open to October. She stood looking at them both, the iron with its damaged shank, the ledger with its careful numbers. Gideon came in without knocking, which was new. "I saw the rack," he said, "and the window." "And the window." He looked at the iron on the table. "That's deliberate." "Of course it's deliberate. He wants you rattled. He wants me to think I'm not safe here, that things are falling apart." She picked up the iron and set it down again. "He wants me to show up at the lease hearing looking like a woman who can't hold her property together." "You gonna let that happen?" She looked at him. "What do you think?" It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it like one. "I can fix the rack. The iron, I know a smith in Talbot who might be able to reforge the shank." "How far is Talbot?" "Half-day's ride." He paused. "I can go early and be back by afternoon if you need me here." "I need you here," she said before she'd entirely decided to say it. "Send Decker if the fence lines are clear." She set her hands flat on the table. "I need to talk to you about Harmon Briggs. He said he'd give me 2 days to line up witnesses. That's today. I need to ride back in." "What do you want me to do while you're gone?" She thought about it. "Stay visible. Work the yard, work the pens. Let anyone watching see activity." She paused. "And keep an eye on June." He nodded. She was pulling on her coat when she heard it. A knock at the back door. Small. 2 taps, close together. The way June knocked. On the rare occasions she knocked. Mara opened the door. June was standing there in the early morning light with her drawing paper in one hand and the cedar piece in the other. She held out the paper. It was a new drawing. Not the canyon this time. It was the south fence line. Mara could tell by the shape of the juniper stand she'd drawn with careful, spiky lines. And at the base of one fence post, June had drawn a shape. Small, deliberately placed. A piece of leather. Red painted, From the color, she'd filled it with using what looked like a red wax pencil. And on the leather, unmistakably, a brand mark. The same rough mark from the cedar piece. Mara took the drawing. She looked at June. "You found something at the fence," she said. "The south section." June looked at her steadily. "Show me." June turned and walked toward the pasture without waiting, the cedar piece held against her chest. Mara followed, and Gideon followed Mara, and none of them said a word as the girl led them through the gate and down the fence line to the third cut section, the oldest one, the one near the junipers, and crouched down at the base of the far post. She pointed. Half buried in the dirt, pressed against the base of the post where the ground was softer, was a strip of leather about 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. Red paint, mostly dried into the grain, and pressed into the leather with a hand tool, still legible even after months in the dirt, a brand mark. Gideon crouched and looked at it without touching it. "That's Rusk's mark," he said. "Or close to it. Modified version." He looked up at Mara. "Cattle brands get registered. If this mark isn't on the registry exactly, it's not legally his, which means if he's been using it to remark stolen cattle, he can't claim them," Mara said. "He can't claim them." She looked at the leather in the dirt, and at June crouching beside it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. The girl hadn't found this by accident. She'd been looking, quietly, methodically, in the way of someone who had decided the adults weren't asking the right questions and had taken it on herself. "How long have you known about this?" Mara asked her. June looked up. She held up one finger, then 2. Then she tilted her hand. "Maybe. A week, maybe 2. Maybe longer," and she was uncertain about time, the way children sometimes were. Gideon made a sound that was half exhale, half something more complicated. "June." She looked at him with an expression that was entirely legible. "I was waiting until I understood it." Mara crouched down despite her knees and looked at the girl straight on. "You don't have to wait," she said. "Not here. You find something, you bring it to me." She paused. "Can you do that?" June held the cedar piece against her chest. She looked at Mara for a long moment, then she nodded. It was a small thing, but nothing small had happened on Bell Ranch since March, and Mara felt it land in her chest with a weight that was not small at all. She stood up, her knees complaining, and looked at the piece of leather in the dirt. "Leave it where it is," she said. "We're going to need people to see it exactly where it was found." She pulled out June's drawing and looked at it one more time. Red leather, Canyon brand, fence post. The shape of what happened was becoming visible, the way outlines became visible in dim light. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each one sharpening the thing you already half knew. She put the drawing in her pocket and looked at Gideon. "Get the fence repaired. I want everything looking like a working ranch by the time Briggs's people ride out. I'll have it done by afternoon." "Good." She looked at the land around her, the pastures, the fence line, the distant canyon cut to the south. Everything Thomas had fought for and then left her to fight for alone, until recently. She turned back toward the house. There was a hearing to prepare for and a canyon to ride into, and a case to build from scraps, and a child's drawings, and a piece of red leather in the dirt. None of it was enough yet, but it was more than she'd had a week ago, and the week wasn't over. Harmon Briggs came through. Not 2 days later, but 3, which was a day more than Mara had wanted and a day less than she'd feared. He rode out to Bell Ranch on a Saturday morning with 2 men behind him. Walt Pruitt, who ran the feed supply and had been in Harmon County for 30 years, and a man named Cass Eller, who was a county surveyor and whose professional habit of verifying measurements made him exactly the kind of witness who was hard to discredit. Mara was in the yard when they arrived. She'd been up since 4, which was getting to be a pattern, and she'd spent the early morning reviewing Thomas's ledgers one more time and writing out a clear sequence of dates and numbers on a single sheet of paper when the calves went missing, which pastures, what Thomas had noted. She had June's drawings folded carefully in her coat pocket. She had the red leather strip still in the ground at the fence post, exactly where June had found it. She shook hands with all 3 men and didn't waste time. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "I need you to see something. 2 things, actually. and I need you to see them in the order I show them because the order matters. Walt Pruitt, who was built like a man who had been lifting grain sacks for 30 years and looked like it, squinted at her. What kind of something? Evidence, she said, of cattle theft. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Harmon said, Whose cattle? Mine. Cass Eller, the surveyor, had a small notebook already in his coat pocket. He took it out. I'll want to record positions, measurements if relevant. I'm counting on it, Mara said. She took them to the south fence line first, to the third cut section near the juniper stand. Gideon had repaired the cut. The wires were spliced and taut again, but she'd marked the post with a piece of white rag tied to the top, and when they got there she pointed at the base. The red leather strip was still in the dirt. Eller crouched down immediately and got out his notebook. Don't touch it yet, Mara said. Look at the mark first. All three men looked. The brand impression in the leather was clear in the morning light, deeper on the left side than the right, the way a brand sat when pressed by a right-handed man working at an angle. That's not the bell mark, Pruitt said. No, it's not. Mara crouched beside Eller. It's a modified mark, close enough to Rusk's registered brand that you'd recognize the lineage, but different enough that it's not the registered mark, which means it can't be legally used to claim cattle. Harmon crossed his arms. You're saying Rusk's been marking cattle with an unregistered brand. I'm saying that mark is on a piece of leather I found at a cut fence on the south boundary of my property. And I'm saying my husband logged 13 calves missing from the south pasture last October. And I'm saying there are things in the canyon below this fence line that I need witnesses to see before I say anything else. The three men looked at each other. The canyon trail's rough, Pruitt said. I know that. My horse isn't young. Neither is mine. She stood. Eller, can you record the position of this leather strip before we move? He already had. He showed her the notebook. Position relative to the post, depth in the soil, dimensions, description of the mark. She nodded. Leave the strip in place, she said. I want it here when the board sends someone. Then she looked at Harmon. I need you to see the canyon. What's in it? He held her gaze for a moment. You've been down there? Not yet. He raised his eyebrows. You're taking us into something you haven't seen yourself? I'm taking you into something a child mapped for me, she said, and so far that child has been right about everything. Gideon led the descent. Mara had asked him to go first because he was the best rider among them, and the trail was exactly as bad as she'd been warned. Loose shale in the upper quarter that skittered under the horse's hooves, a narrow shelf turned about halfway down where the wall on the left came close enough to scrape a boot. Decker stayed at the top with the horses after the descent, his bad leg not suited for the footing. June had wanted to come. Mara had said no, and June had looked at her with an expression that was not quite argument but not acceptance either, the look of someone cataloging an injustice for later, and stayed at the top with Decker. Gideon reached the basin floor first and pulled his horse up and went still. Mara came around the shelf turn and saw it before she'd fully registered what she was seeing. The basin was wider than she'd expected from June's drawing, maybe 200 yards across, floored with hard-packed dirt and scrub grass that had clearly been grazed down. The walls were natural canyon stone, high enough on three sides to block sightlines from above. And on the far side, built against the south wall using cut timber and rope-strung rails, was an enclosure. A proper one. Not a rough corral thrown together in a week, but a structure that had taken real time and planning. Corner posts sunk deep, rails fitted carefully, a water trough on the east side that was fed by a pipe running down the canyon wall to a seep she could hear but not see. Inside the enclosure were cattle. She counted without speaking, then she counted again. 21 head. Young animals. Calves grown to yearlings, some of them nearly mature enough to be moved to sale. Their hides were dusty and the space was getting crowded for their size, but they were alive and they were in reasonable condition, and she could see from where she sat on her horse the brand marks on their left shoulders. 2 brands, the original, fainter mark beneath, and over it, applied later in a different technique, the rough red mark from the leather strip. Her husband's bell mark was still visible under the overstrike. If you knew what to look for, If you were standing close enough, you could read both brands layered on top of each other, like two sentences written on the same page. She became aware that she'd stopped breathing and made herself breathe. Pruitt was beside her now, and Harmon and Eller was already writing in his notebook with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. 21 head, Gideon said, from closer to the enclosure. He'd ridden up to the rails and was looking at the brands. His voice was flat in the way of someone keeping careful control of their tone. My calves were logged at 13, Mara said. These are yearlings. They've grown. He looked back at her. Some of these could be from more than one season. She looked at the overstruck brands, at the rough red mark layered over Thomas's careful bell. She thought about Thomas sitting at that desk in October, writing numbers in his careful hand, writing South Canyon. Rusk. In the margin in a different, faster hand. She thought about him deciding not to make trouble. She thought about what the trouble might have cost him in the end. Eller, she said, how long will it take you to record all 21 animals, both brand marks? 2 hours, he said without looking up from his notebook. Maybe less. Take as long as you need. She turned her horse and rode to the south wall where the structure was built and looked at the lean-to June had drawn beside the enclosure. It was real. A small shelter, barely enough for one person to sleep in, with a fire ring outside it that had been used recently enough that the ash was still pale. Supply crates stacked against the wall, 2 saddle ropes, a branding iron leaning against the wood, the working end darkened with use. She didn't touch the iron. She looked at it for a long time. Harmon rode up beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same things. Thomas knew, he said. It wasn't a question. He knew something. He wasn't sure enough to push it. She paused. Or maybe he was, and he was protecting something. Protecting me from what it would cost to fight it. That sounds like Thomas. It does. She said it without bitterness and without grief, just with the flat recognition of someone who loved a man and also knew his shape exactly, the precise dimensions of his courage and his caution. He was wrong, but I understand why. Harmon was quiet again. Then, this is enough, Mara. What you've got here is enough. For the lease board. For the sheriff, too, I'd think. She looked at the branding iron against the wall. I need the lease board first. Get my claim secured before anything else moves, or Rusk's lawyers will find an angle to tie this up while the hearing comes and goes. When's the hearing? 11 days. Harmon made a sound in his chest that wasn't quite a laugh. All right. He turned his horse. Let me go help Eller count. They were back on the ranch by early afternoon, and Mara spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled motion that she recognized as the way she functioned when the thing she actually felt was too large to feel directly. She made coffee. She fed the animals. She sat with Eller's notes and her own ledger and built a timeline on paper, matching dates to animal counts to fence cuts. Gideon found her at the desk after supper, still at it. You should sleep, he said from the doorway. Probably. You won't. But you should. She looked up. Did June eat? She ate. She's in the bunkhouse. He paused. She drew more tonight. I don't know what. She stopped when I came in. Mara set her pen down. She doesn't have to stop. I know. I told her that. He leaned on the doorframe. He looked tired himself. The real tired of physical work, the kind that sat in the shoulders. What happens when you take this to the lease board? I present the timeline. Eller's survey notes, the brand comparison, Pruitt and Harmon as witnesses. She rubbed the back of her neck. Rusk is going to push back hard. He's got a lawyer on retainer in the county seat. I know that because Thomas mentioned it once after their second land dispute. What's the lawyer's angle going to be? Probably that I'm a desperate woman making accusations to save a failing lease. She said it without particular emotion. That we moved the cattle ourselves, or paid someone to. That the timeline is manufactured. She picked up the pen and turned it in her fingers. He's also going to use the brand rack damage. He'll say it shows the ranch is falling apart. The rack's been repaired. I know, but he'll have prior, or someone say they saw it damaged, and people will remember the image of a broken brand rack on Bell Ranch, more than they'll remember that it got fixed. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, what do you need from me at the hearing? She looked at him. Nothing. You're a hired hand. If you speak, he'll use you. Say you've got a stake in the outcome. Say you're trying to get control of the ranch through me. He'll say that anyway. Yes, but if you stay quiet, he'll have less to work with. She held his gaze. I need to fight this myself, with the people from town behind me. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hurt, not resigned, something more considered than either. All right, he said. I'm not trying to cut you out. I know what you're doing. He straightened up from the door frame. You're making sure the case stands on its own, without anyone being able to say it leaned on something personal. He paused. That's the right call. She wasn't sure she'd expected him to understand it that clearly. Yes, she said. I'll keep the ranch running. Make sure everything looks exactly like what it is. A functioning operation with numbers to show. He turned to go. Then he stopped. The crack in the brand iron. Decker took it to Talbert. Smith says he can reforge the shank. Good as original. Something loosened slightly in her chest. When? End of next week. Before the hearing. She nodded. She turned back to her papers. She heard him walk across the porch and down the steps, and then the quiet settled back around her, the particular quiet of a house that held only one person again, which was a quiet she was still learning to live in. Mott, Caldwell Russ came back on Monday. He didn't come to the house this time. He came to the yard and stood in it like he'd been there before and would be again, and he had Pryor with him and two other men she didn't recognize. They arrived when Gideon was working the far pen and Decker was checking water lines on the north end, which meant she was closest, and she walked out to meet them alone. Mara, he smiled, heard you had some visitors Saturday. She kept her face neutral. People ride out. Harmon Briggs? Walt Pruitt? He tilted his head slightly. And a county surveyor. That's an interesting group for a social call. She said nothing. You've been in the canyon, he said. His voice had changed. Not threatening exactly, but the warmth was gone from it, the performed concern. What was underneath was harder and more honest. I want you to think very carefully about what you think you found down there. What I found is a matter for the lease board. The lease board. He nodded slowly. Here's the thing about lease boards, Mara. They're made up of men, local men who do business with each other. He let that sit for a moment. Men who understand that the frontier doesn't run itself on good intentions. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining how things work. He spread his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man explaining something to someone less experienced. Those calves in the basin, I can explain those. Stray animals that drifted through a cut fence onto the south strip. My men found them, put them in an enclosure to keep them safe. I had every intention of returning them once the ownership question was sorted. The ownership question. The canyon strip. The lease boundary is unclear on the southern edge. My lawyer has argued that for 2 years, and the land office has acknowledged the ambiguity. He met her eyes. Those cattle could be characterized as found animals held pending determination of the boundary. With a second brand marked over the original, his jaw tightened very slightly. Protective marking. Standard practice for found stock. She looked at him. He had an answer for everything, which she'd expected. The answers weren't good, but they were the kind of answers that could tie things up for months in a legal dispute while the lease hearing came and went, and the board ruled against an undefended claim. You knew Thomas suspected, she said. Something moved across his face. It wasn't guilt exactly. She wasn't sure guilt was in his repertoire. But it was the specific stillness of a man who has just had something he thought was private named out loud. Thomas was a cautious man, Caldwell said. He didn't like conflict. No, he didn't. She held his gaze. I'm not Thomas. The silence between them had a texture to it now. Pryor, behind Caldwell, shifted his weight. The two other men she didn't know stayed still. I'll make you a better offer, Caldwell said. Better than before. Enough to buy property elsewhere. A real fresh start. He said it gently, which was worse than the hard version. You've been through enough, Mara. You don't need this fight. What I don't need, she said, is to be told by you what I need. He studied her. You're going to make this very hard on yourself. I've been doing hard things since March. I've gotten used to it. She looked at Pryor and then at the two men she didn't know. All four of you need to leave my property. Caldwell put his hat back on. He looked at her with something that had moved past calculation into something colder and more personal. The hearing is in 11 days, he said. A lot can happen in 11 days. Yes, she said, it can. He left, but this time the threat in his leaving was naked, without the wrapper of concern around it, and they both knew it. She stood in the yard until the dust from their horses settled. Then she went inside and sat at the table for 10 minutes doing nothing, which was what she needed to do before she could move again. Then she got up and went back to work. She was in the barn that evening, checking on the stock, when she heard the sound from outside. Not a crash, but a heavy scrape, followed by something hitting the ground. She came out fast and found Gideon standing near the east wall, looking at the brand rack. It had been pulled down again. Same method as before. The anchor bolts stripped, the whole rack on the ground. But this time, more of the irons were damaged. The restored bell iron, Decker had brought it back from Talbert that afternoon, the shank reforged, good as original, and rehung it on the rack with something that might have been ceremony, was on the ground with a new crack in it. Different from the first one. Worse. Gideon looked at her. His face was very still. You didn't hear them? She said. I was in the back pen. They moved fast. He crouched and picked up the bell iron carefully. This was meant to be seen, not just damage, a message. I know what it is. He held the iron and looked at it. The crack went through the bell shape itself this time, splitting the design. She felt it somewhere in the place where rational assessment stopped and something older lived. Mara, his voice was careful. I know you want to fight this yourself, and I know why, but I need to tell you something. She looked at him. Pryor was one of the men who rode up with Rusk today, he said. The other two I didn't recognize, but one of them, the taller one, I've seen him before. In Dalton Springs. She went still. What? He worked a spread outside Dalton Springs 2 years before I left. The spread had a land dispute with a neighbor. The neighbor ended up selling after some equipment damage and a fire in one of the outbuildings. Gideon set the iron down on the ground carefully. That man's name is Sutter, and he works for people who do what Rusk does, which is push until the other person breaks. A hired problem. That's one way to put it. She looked at the cracked iron on the ground. So Rusk is escalating. He's done the easy things. This is what comes after the easy things don't work. She picked up the iron herself. The crack was through the design, but the shank was intact. The reforged part had held. She turned it in her hands and thought about Thomas standing at this rack 20 years ago, hanging the brand he'd designed, probably feeling the particular satisfaction of something that was entirely his. I'm not breaking, she said. I know. But I want you to tell me what you know about Sutter, everything you remember. She looked up at Gideon. Because if he's here for more than property damage, I need to know what that looks like. It looks like the fire in Dalton Springs, Gideon said. A barn. Empty, fortunately, but it was the last thing that happened before the neighbor agreed to sell. She held the cracked iron. She thought about her barn, about the cattle inside it, about June in the bunkhouse. Can you sleep in the barn tonight? She said. I was going to ask if you wanted me to. She nodded. I'll keep the house. Decker can take the bunkhouse end nearest the door. She paused. June stays in the room with the lock. I'll tell her. Tell her. Mara stopped. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't June's mother. She wasn't anything to June, technically, except the woman who'd given her a room with a real door. Tell her to stay put till morning, and if she hears anything, she knocks on the wall twice. She'll do it. He said it with certainty, which meant he knew his daughter, and knowing his daughter, he was certain she'd understand the situation and comply. It was a specific kind of quiet confidence that Mara filed away without comment. She went back inside and placed the cracked iron on the table and looked at it under the lamp for a long time. The hearing was in 9 days now. 9 days in which Caldwell Rusk had a man named Sutter on her property, or close to it, and the lease board was full of men who did business with each other. and the canyon basin held 21 stolen calves that Rusk was already building a legal explanation for. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not the timeline this time, Suck. She had that. This was something different. She was writing down every person in Harmon who had ever been on the wrong side of a deal with Caldwell Rusk. Every name she could remember from conversations with Thomas, from things Decker had mentioned, from what Harmon Briggs had said and not quite said in the feed store. It was a short list. Then she thought harder and longer, and the list got a little longer, and each name on it was a person who might have a reason to stand up at a lease board hearing and say things the board hadn't considered. She was not going to show up to that hearing and defend herself alone. She was going to show up with every person who had a reason to want the truth on the table. What happened 4 days before the hearing was not what Mara had planned, but nothing in the past months had gone according to plan, and she'd developed a rough understanding that the ability to adapt was worth more than the ability to plan in a situation like this. She was riding the south fence line in the early morning when Decker came up behind her at a pace that wasn't his usual unhurried walk. He was pushing his horse, which he almost never did on account of his leg. "Someone's down at the canyon," he said when he reached her. She looked at him. "Rusk's men?" "Can't tell, but there's dust from the trail entrance. Something went in." She thought about the enclosure, about 21 calves in a canyon basin that Rusk now knew she'd been inside, about a man named Sutter who had helped burn a barn in Dalton Springs. "Get Gideon," she said. "Tell him now." Decker turned his horse without a word and rode. She didn't wait. She pushed her horse toward the canyon entrance, knowing it was probably foolish and doing it anyway, because the thing in the canyon was her proof and her case, and the truth about what had happened to Thomas's cattle, and if Rusk was moving those animals before the hearing, she was not going to sit at the fence line and watch him. She reached the canyon entrance at a hard canter and pulled up short. There were 3 horses tied at the top of the trail. She didn't recognize any of them. Below, she could hear sounds from the basin. Movement, voices she couldn't make out over distance. She got down from her horse and tied it and looked down the trail. She was not going down alone. She knew that. It was one of those clear-headed recognitions that came through fear rather than despite it. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned. Gideon was coming fast, Decker a length behind him. And behind Decker, to her complete surprise, were 2 more riders, Harmon Briggs and Walt Pruitt, who had apparently been on their way out to the ranch for reasons of their own and met Decker on the road. "Down there?" Gideon said, pulling up. 3 horses, voices in the basin. She looked at the group, 5 of them, including Decker. "If they're moving the cattle, we need to see it, all of us." "That trail's rough," Pruitt said. It was what he'd said before. "We've all been down it," Harmon said. "Go." They went down. The footing was bad and the horses were nervous on the shale, and it took longer than she wanted. When they came around the shelf and into the basin, 3 men were inside the enclosure. 2 of them she didn't know. The third was Pryor. Pryor saw them at the same moment she saw him. His face went through several things in fast succession: surprise, calculation, and then a kind of blankness that was its own kind of tell. One of the other 2 men was holding a rope attached to a yearling. The animal was clearly being led toward the enclosure gate. They were moving them. Right now, 4 days before the hearing. "Pryor," she said, loud enough to carry across the basin. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "Step away from those animals." "Mrs. Bell." He smiled, which took effort she could see. "I'm not sure what you think. I think you're on my land moving cattle that are marked with a forged brand over my husband's mark." She looked at the group behind her. "And I have 5 witnesses who can see exactly what I see." The man with the rope looked at Pryor. Pryor looked at the 5 riders and did math that came out the wrong way for him. "Put the rope down," Harmon said, from behind Mara. His voice was the voice of a man who had been in Harmon County for 30 years and whose word meant something. "Son, put the rope down right now." The man with the rope put it down. Pryor took a slow breath. He looked at Mara with an expression she read as a man recalibrating, storing information, deciding what the next move looked like. He was not beaten. He was regrouping. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." She looked at Cass Eller's notes in her coat, at the basin around her, at 21 animals standing in an enclosure built on her land. but it's moving in a direction you're not going to like. Pryor got on his horse and rode out. The other two followed him. Mara sat on her horse in the basin and let the silence settle. Harmon rode up beside her. "We're all going to the hearing," he said. "All of us who were here today." "And Eller," she said. "He needs to document this. The cattle positions, the brands, everything. Today, before anything else changes." "I'll send for him." She looked at the 21 animals in the enclosure. They were calm now, the way cattle were calm when the disturbance was human and already leaving. One of the yearlings near the front of the enclosure stood with its left shoulder toward her, and she could see both marks. Her husband's bell, patient and clear beneath the rough red overstrike. She had 9 days left, but the shape of the hearing had shifted. She turned her horse toward the trail and climbed back out of the canyon into the morning, the sun ahead of her over the east ridge, and the ranch waiting behind it. Cass Eller spent 4 hours in the canyon that afternoon. He documented everything: the enclosure dimensions, the post depths, the water pipe running down the canyon wall to the seep. He measured the distance from the enclosure to the cut fence line above and recorded it in feet. He examined all 21 animals and noted both brand marks on each one, the original bell mark, faint but legible beneath, and the rough overstrike in red that didn't match any registered brand in the county record he carried in his notebook. He sketched the lean-to, the fire ring, the supply crates, and the branding iron leaning against the south wall, noting its position and the darkened working end. He did all of this with the steady, methodical attention of a man who had spent his career producing documents that could not be argued with, and when he came back up the trail in the late afternoon, his notebook had 23 new pages in it. Mara waited at the top. She hadn't gone back down after Pryor left. She'd sent Gideon and Decker back to the ranch to keep things running, and she'd stayed at the canyon entrance with Harmon and Pruitt, the three of them not talking much, just sitting in the sun with their horses and waiting. When Eller climbed out and handed her the notebook, she read the first several pages standing up. Then she looked at him. "Will you testify?" she said. "That's what a survey witness does," he said, like it was obvious, which to him it probably was. "Rusk has a lawyer. I've been deposed before." He took his notebook back and tucked it in his coat. "My measurements don't change because someone asked me the same question 3 different ways." Harmon made a sound that was the closest he got to a laugh. "That's why we brought him," he said to Mara. She folded her copy of the brand comparison she'd been holding and put it in her coat. 8 days to the hearing. The enclosure was documented. The witnesses were committed. The red leather strip was still in the ground at the fence post. The cracked bell iron was on her kitchen table, evidence of what Rusk was willing to do to shake her. What she still needed was the brand registry comparison. Proof, in writing from the county record, that the mark on those cattle was not Rusk's registered brand. Without that, his lawyers would argue the overstrike was a standard marking variation, customary practice. Nothing irregular. "The brand registry," she said to Eller. "How fast can you pull the comparison?" "I can have it by Thursday. Registry office in the county seat keeps copies of all active brands. I'll write out tomorrow." "That's 2 days before the hearing." "It'll be ready." He mounted. "Stop worrying about the things that are handled and worry about the things that aren't." She watched him ride out and thought that was probably the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a month. The thing that wasn't handled was Sutter. She hadn't seen him since the Monday visit, when he'd ridden in with Rusk and Pryor and stood watching with that careful professional attention. Gideon hadn't seen him either, but the barn was still standing and the cattle were still in the pens and nothing had caught fire, which meant either Sutter had left or he was waiting for something. Waiting for the hearing, maybe. Waiting to see if the hearing went Rusk's way before deciding whether more pressure was needed. She told Gideon this on Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, the ledger and the timeline and the brand comparison all spread out in a kind of argument she'd been having with herself for days. "If the hearing goes badly," she said, "what does Sutter do?" Gideon turned his cup. "Hard to say. In Dalton Springs, the fire came after a failed legal negotiation. So, after, not during. So I might have more time than I think. Or the situation here is different enough that the pattern doesn't hold." He looked at her. "I don't want to give you false comfort." "I don't want it either." She looked at the papers on the table. "I need someone watching the property the night before the hearing, Not Decker. He needs his sleep. He's testifying about the fence cuts and the ledger dates. Not you, because you're keeping the stock calm in case something does happen. I can do both. You can't. Not reliably, she thought. Harmon's nephew, the young one, helps at the feed store. Does he ride? I don't know his nephew. His name's Ellis. He's about 20, big through the shoulders. I've seen him handle a difficult horse without getting stupid about it. She made a note. I'll ask Harmon tomorrow. You're not going to sleep again, are you? Probably not much. He was quiet for a moment, then, you should know the stock is in good shape, better than when I got here. The calves from the South Pen have put on weight with the pasture rotation. If the board asks about cattle numbers, what you've got is a legitimate operation. She looked at him. You rotated the pastures? You said keep the ranch running. Rotation's basic management. He paused. You didn't know. I've been focused on... She gestured at the papers. I know what you've been focused on. He wasn't saying it to make her feel guilty. He said it the way he said most things, booked as a fact, without performance. The ranch has been running. That's what you needed. She sat with that for a moment. The careful, steady accumulation of someone doing what needed doing without requiring her to notice. She thought about how many ways that was different from what she'd been expecting when she posted that notice at the feed store, and how many ways it was different from almost every other interaction she'd had with a man about this land. Gideon, she looked at him directly. What do you want out of this? After the hearing, assuming it goes right, what are you expecting? He held her gaze. I want what we agreed to. Wages and a proper contract. That's not what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. I know what you mean. He set his cup down. I'm not expecting anything. I came here for work and a place for June. That's what I've got. What happens after the hearing is what you decide, and I don't have a stake in pushing it in any direction. Most men would, she said. I know. He stood, picking up the cup. I'm going to check the barn before I turn in. You want the lamp left on? No, she said. I'll manage. He went out. She sat at the table in the quiet for a while, the papers around her, and felt something complicated and not entirely uncomfortable moving through her chest that she decided not to examine too closely yet. Wednesday, she rode into Harmon alone. Ellis Briggs was exactly what she remembered, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way of young men who had learned that talking less was usually smarter, with the careful hands of someone raised around horses. She explained what she needed in about 4 sentences. He listened without interrupting. You want me to watch the property the night before the hearing, he said, and if something happens, I come get you. Or Gideon Hale, who'll be in the barn. Don't try to handle anything yourself. Just watch and come get one of us. What are you worried about specifically? Fire, she said, or cattle movement, either one. He nodded. What does Harmon pay me to work the store? She told him she'd pay double. He said that was fair, and he'd be there Thursday night. Her second stop was the sheriff's office, which she'd been putting off because the sheriff, a man named Galt, broad through the middle and careful with his commitments, had been in the county for 20 years and had always managed to be somewhere else when Caldwell Rusk's name came up in anything complicated. He was in his office. He looked at her the way men looked at her when they already knew what she was going to say and hadn't decided yet whether to be helpful about it. She put Eller's preliminary notes on his desk. The brand comparison, the dates from the ledger, the red leather strip. She'd had Eller document it in place and then collected it, and she set it on the desk now in a small cloth pouch. 21 cattle, she said. My land. My brand underneath. Rusk's unregistered mark over the top. 3 witnesses and a county surveyor's documentation. Galt looked at the papers. He picked up the leather strip in its pouch and looked at the brand mark through the cloth without opening it. He set it down. You're coming to me before the hearing, he said. I'm coming to you now because I believe Caldwell Rusk has a man on or near my property who has previously been involved in property damage for hire. I want it on record that I told you. Who's the man? Sutter. I don't have a first name. He was involved in a fire outside Dalton Springs 2 years ago. A barn, in connection with a land dispute. Galt wrote the name. She noticed he wrote it without asking her to spell it, which meant he'd heard it before, or something like it, and that was interesting. I'm not in a position to act on Rusk directly without, he started. I'm not asking you to act on Rusk, she said. I'm asking you to know where I told you to look if something happens to my property before the hearing. She met his eyes. And I'm asking you to be at the hearing. He looked at her. The lease board hearing is a civil matter. It's going to have criminal evidence in it. I'd like a lawman present. He was quiet. He looked at the papers again. He had the specific expression of a man weighing his relationship with Rusk's business against what was sitting on his desk, and she watched him do the math without helping him. I'll be there, he said, finally. Can't promise any action until there's a formal complaint and documentation filed. Eller is filing his survey documentation with the board Thursday. That's documentation. Then I'll be there. She thanked him, which cost her something, and left. Thursday came and went without fire or cattle movement or any sign of Sutter, which was either good or a different kind of bad that she hadn't anticipated. Ellis Briggs was steady at his post through a cold night and came to the kitchen door at dawn to report nothing unusual, and she thanked him and paid him and sent him home. Eller filed his documentation with the board clerk that afternoon, all 23 pages, plus the brand comparison he'd pulled from the county registry in the county seat. The unregistered mark on the Canyon cattle differed from Rusk's registered brand in 2 key measurements and 1 structural element, the crossing bar's angle and length. It was not his registered brand. It was close enough to suggest intention and different enough to constitute a separate unregistered mark, which meant every animal bearing it had been branded illegally. Mara read the registry comparison twice and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Friday morning, the day of the hearing, she was up at 4 again. She washed her face with cold water and dressed in the clothes she'd laid out the night before. Her good dark skirt, the wool jacket Thomas had bought her 3 winters ago that still fit well, her practical boots because the hearing was in a building with a wooden floor, and she wasn't going to spend 2 hours in uncomfortable shoes just to look like someone's idea of a widow. She came out of the bedroom and found June sitting at the kitchen table. The girl had the cedar piece in her hands as always, but she was also dressed. Her good dress, the dark one with the buttons, her hair combed and tied back neatly. She looked at Mara with those steady dark eyes. Mara stopped. How did you know what day it was? June held up the cedar piece. Mara looked at the piece of burned wood, then at the girl. Then she went and poured coffee because she needed a moment. You're not coming to the hearing, she said. It's not a place for children. June didn't move. She sat with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. June. The girl looked at her. Then she set the cedar piece down on the table very deliberately and slid it toward Mara. Mara picked it up. She turned it in her hands. The burn mark on the edge, the brand shape that wasn't the Bell brand. She'd been thinking of it as the Canyon mark, the evidence, the thing that started all of this. But June had been carrying it since before she arrived at Bell Ranch. She'd had it in Dalton Springs, or wherever she'd been before. She'd brought it from somewhere else entirely. Where did you get this? Mara asked, for the 3rd time in total. The first 2 times June hadn't answered. This time June pointed to herself. Then she touched her chest. You made it? June shook her head. She touched her chest again. Then she touched the table, and then the wall, and then she pointed toward the window and the direction of the barn. Mara watched her. June picked up a scrap of paper and drew quickly. A structure, a building with a pitched roof. And inside the building, a woman. Then from the building she drew a line, and at the end of the line she drew a fire. She drew carefully. Then she drew the burn piece separate from the fire, with a small arrow indicating it had come from the fire and not been destroyed by it. Mara sat down. That was your house, she said, before Dalton Springs. June nodded. And your mother was in it when it burned. June's hands went still. She looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she nodded again, once, short. The room was very quiet. Mara set the cedar piece down on the table between them. She didn't say anything for a while because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be insufficient. The girl across from her had been carrying a piece of her burned house and her dead mother and a fire that someone had set. Mara understood now, with a cold certainty, that the fire hadn't been accidental. And she'd been carrying it in silence for 7 months, waiting, the way she waited for everything, until she understood it well enough to act on it. That mark on the cedar, Mara said carefully. The burn mark. Did someone set that fire? June held very still. Then she nodded. Someone who wanted your father's land. June looked at her. She reached out and tapped the cedar piece. Then she touched the drawing of the canyon she'd done days ago. She pointed at the mark on the cedar and then at the rough mark she'd drawn on the canyon cattle. Mara went cold all the way through. Same mark, she said. The same brand mark. June met her eyes and held them. Sutter. The man from Dalton Springs whom Gideon had recognized. The fire outside Dalton Springs 2 years ago. A barn, Gideon had said. But June had drawn a house with a woman inside. Not a barn. A house. Gideon had said fire, but he'd said the barn was empty, and maybe the barn was what he'd been told, what he'd been able to learn from outside, while the truth of it was something only a child who'd been there would know. June, Mara's voice was very steady. Does your father know what you know about the fire? June looked at her hands. She shook her head. Why not? The girl was still for a long moment. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote, for the first time, actual words on the paper. Her handwriting was careful and small. He was sick when it happened. I don't want to make him more sad. Mara looked at the sentence. She read it twice. She thought about Gideon in the barn and in the kitchen and at the fence line, carrying the weight of a wife lost and a daughter gone silent and a life dismantled, not knowing the full shape of what had dismantled it. She thought about what this meant for the hearing. June, she said, I need you to write down what you know, what you saw, all of it in your own words. She got up and found a clean sheet of paper and put it in front of the girl. I'm going to ask Gideon to come inside, and then you're going to show him what you showed me. June looked at the clean paper. Then she looked at Mara with an expression that was very young and very old at the same time. It's going to hurt him, Mara said quietly. Knowing. But not knowing is hurting him too, just slower. She held the girl's gaze. You've been protecting him. That's love. But he's strong enough to know the truth. I think you know that. June was still for a long moment. Then she picked up the pencil. Gideon came in from the barn with hay on his sleeve and the easy stride of someone who'd already done 2 hours of work, and he stopped when he saw the look on Mara's face, and then he saw June at the table with the paper in front of her covered in her small, careful handwriting. What is this? He said. Sit down, Mara said. He sat. He read what June had written. He read it slowly, which meant he was reading it more than once, and Mara watched his face and saw what happened to it. Not a collapse, but something more like a structure settling under a weight it had been bearing wrong, shifting into a configuration that hurt more but held better. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was careful. Sutter. Yes, Mara said. He was there. Not a question. He already knew somewhere, and had either not let himself know he knew or had known and not known what to do with it. He was there, she said. And he's here. And the mark June found in the canyon and on the leather strip at the fence, it's the same mark she's seen before. Gideon set the paper down. He looked at June. The girl was watching him with those dark eyes, and she had the cedar piece in her hands again, turned toward him this time, the burn mark showing. June. His voice broke slightly on her name and then came back together. Why didn't you tell me? She picked up the pencil and wrote on the bottom of the paper. You were sick. Then you were sad. I waited until I could help. He looked at those words for a long time. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not taking the pencil, not the cedar piece, just his hand over her hands. She didn't pull away. Mara looked at the window. The sun was coming up hard in gold over the east ridge, and the hearing was in 4 hours, and there was still everything to do. This changes things, Gideon said, when he'd found his voice again. What June knows, what she can write down, that's not just a land dispute anymore. No, Mara said. It's not. She looked at him. But for this morning, the land dispute is what I need to survive first. The rest of it, Sutter, what happened in Dalton Springs, that goes to Galt. Today, after the hearing. He'll run, Gideon said. If Rusk's case falls apart at the hearing, Sutter will know, and he'll run. Then Galt needs to know before the hearing ends. She thought fast. I'll send Decker to the sheriff's office this morning, before we ride to town, with June's written statement about the fire and the mark. Decker doesn't know what any of that means. He doesn't need to. He hands it to Galt, and Galt reads it. She looked at June. Can you write it again, separately from what you just wrote? Just about the fire and the mark and Sutter, what you saw. June looked at the clean paper Mara put in front of her. She picked up the pencil without hesitation. While June wrote, Mara went to the window and stood looking out at the yard, the barn, the brand rack on the east wall. Repaired again, the irons rehung, the cracked bell iron back in its place with the split running through the bell design like a scar. The kind of thing that was damaged and still functional and would show the damage for as long as it lasted. She understood that kind of thing well enough by now. The hearing was held in the Harmon County Courthouse, a two-story building on the main street that doubled as the land office and the meeting hall, and on one occasion Mara remembered, a temporary shelter for 3 families whose houses had burned in a dry summer 15 years ago. The lease board was 5 men, appointed by the county, all of them over 50. All of them with the specific weathered quality of men who had been making decisions about land for a long time. She arrived 20 minutes early. Gideon drove the wagon with Decker beside him, which left Mara to ride in on her horse and tie it at the rail and walk up the steps alone. That was deliberate. She wanted the board to see her arrive independently. Harmon Briggs was already inside, with Walt Pruitt and Cass Eller. Sheriff Galt was in the back corner with his hat in his hands. Decker had ridden ahead to deliver June's written statement to the sheriff's office, and had apparently managed it without incident because Galt had a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket that she recognized by its size. Caldwell Rusk arrived at 5 minutes to the hour with his lawyer, a man named Forsyth from the county seat, who wore a good coat and had the smooth efficiency of someone who charged by the hour and was efficient about earning it, and 2 other men, one of whom was Pryor. Sutter was not with them. She noted that. The board chairman, a man named Hector Vane, who had been doing this for 22 years, called the hearing to order in the flat, procedural voice of someone who had presided over 100 of these and found most of them tiresome. Bell Ranch lease renewal, he said. Lessee Maribel Bell. We'll hear from the lessee first, then any contesting parties, then the board will consider. Mara stood. She'd prepared what she was going to say. She'd rehearsed it Tuesday night sitting at the desk after everyone was asleep, speaking quietly into the empty kitchen so she knew how it sounded out loud, where the pauses were, where she tended to rush. She was not a natural speaker in formal settings. She was better in conversation, better when she could read the person across from her. But she knew this material, and she knew what mattered, and she kept to that. She laid out the timeline. The cattle losses in October. The fence cuts. The canyon enclosure and its contents. The brand marks, original and overstruck. She cited Eller's documentation and asked him to confirm the page numbers, which he did from his seat. She described the red leather strip and where it was found and who found it. She named Harmon Briggs and Walt Pruitt as additional witnesses to the enclosure contents. She was halfway through when Forsyth interrupted. With respect to the board, he said, Mrs. Bell is presenting what amounts to a theft allegation against my client, which is a criminal matter and outside the board's jurisdiction. The board is here to assess lease renewal criteria, not adjudicate property crimes. The theft is relevant, Mara said before Vane could speak, because the stolen cattle are the primary reason my numbers appear deficient to the board's preliminary review. 21 animals from my herd have been in a canyon enclosure on my own land for up to 2 seasons. When those animals are returned to my count, my numbers meet the renewal criteria. Vane looked at Forsyth. She's got a point about the count. Forsyth pivoted without missing a beat. The animals in the basin were found stock. My client's employees discovered them through a damaged section of fence and secured them appropriately pending boundary clarification. With an unregistered brand marked over the original, Eller said, from his seat, in the tone of a man who had not been asked to speak but found the alternative intolerable. Forsyth looked at him. Are you a party to this proceeding? I'm a county surveyor whose documentation was filed with this board yesterday. Eller held up his notebook. And I'm prepared to read the registry comparison into the record if the board wants it. Vane said, read it. Forsyth objected. Vane said read it anyway. Eller read the relevant section in his flat, precise voice, including the 2 measurement discrepancies and the structural variation. And when he was done, the room was quiet in a way that had a particular quality to it, the quality of people doing arithmetic they didn't expect to be doing. Caldwell Rusk, who had been sitting still and watchful throughout, spoke for the first time. He addressed the board directly, not Mara, not Forsyth. I've operated in this county for 19 years, he said. I have 42 employees. My operation supplies beef to half the markets in the valley. What this woman is presenting is a desperate attempt to manufacture a case against a neighboring rancher because she cannot manage the property her husband left her. He spread his hands on the table. I'm sorry for her loss. Thomas Bell was a decent man. But decent men don't always marry women suited to frontier ranching, and the board should not let sympathy override the practical question of whether Bell Ranch has a capable operator. The room was not on his side anymore, so Mara could feel that, the specific texture of a room that's shifting, but his words landed the way he'd intended them to, because he was good at this and he'd had 19 years of practice. She heard the shift in the quality of the silence, the brief wobble. She stood up again. Vane looked at her. Forsyth started to object, and Vane said, Let her speak. Mr. Russ just told this board that my husband didn't marry a woman suited to frontier ranching. She kept her voice level. I'd like to remind the board that I've been running Bell Ranch since March, that in that time I identified stolen livestock, located and documented an illegal enclosure on my own property, gathered credible witnesses, and brought a complete evidentiary case before this board without missing a single day of ranch operation. She looked at Vane. I don't know what Mr. Rusk thinks frontier ranching requires, but I'd submit that what I've done in the past several weeks is exactly what it requires. Harmon Briggs said, from the side of the room, She's right. Just that. 2 words from a man who'd been in Harmon County longer than Rusk. Walt Pruitt said, Agreed. Rusk looked at both of them with an expression that was very controlled and very cold. The board took 40 minutes. Mara sat in the hall outside with Gideon, who had come in and taken a seat beside her without asking. Decker was on her other side. None of them spoke. Down the hall, through the closed door, she could hear voices that were too muffled to distinguish. Gideon said, after a while, Whatever they decide, what you did in there was right. Don't, she said. I'm not trying to comfort you. Then what are you doing? Telling you what I saw. He said it matter-of-factly. You can decide what it's worth. She didn't answer. She watched the door. When Vane opened it and said, Mrs. Bell, she stood. The renewal was granted. Full term, 5 years, including the South Canyon Strip, which the board ruled was demonstrably active pasture land based on Eller's documentation of the enclosure and its contents. She stood and heard it, and felt the word granted move through her in a way that wasn't triumph exactly, because triumph implied surprise, and she had believed in this too hard and too long for it to feel like surprise. What it felt like was the satisfaction of something standing up that you'd spent months building, and also, underneath that, the very quiet grief of knowing Thomas should have been here for it. Rusk was already on his feet when she turned around. His face was arranged carefully, but behind the arrangement something had broken loose that wasn't going to be put back together easily. Pryor was looking at the floor. Forsyth was writing something in his folder. Rusk looked at Mara across the room. This isn't the end of it, he said. Mr. Rusk. Galt stepped forward from the back corner, and his voice had the flat authority of a man who had made a decision and was done weighing it. I need to ask you a few questions about a man named Sutter and about a fire in Dalton Springs 2 years ago. He folded the piece of paper in his breast pocket without taking it out. I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer before you answer. The room had gone very still. Forsyth looked up from his folder with the expression of a man recalculating his day and finding it considerably longer than he'd planned. Rusk looked at Galt. He looked at Forsyth. He looked once at Mara. Find Sutter, Mara said quietly. Not to Rusk, to Galt. Galt nodded. Already sent someone. She turned and walked out into the hall, and then through the front door and down the steps and into the clear, hard morning sun of Harmon County, and she stood on the steps of the courthouse and breathed. Gideon came out behind her. He stood beside her on the steps without saying anything, which was what the moment required. After a while, Decker came out too, and stood on her other side, and the three of them stood in the sun together, none of them saying anything worth saying yet. Across the street, at the hitching rail, Mara's horse stood patiently in the way of horses who had been standing at rails for a long time and had decided that waiting was simply what life required sometimes. She walked over and untied it. There was a ranch to get back to. Sutter was found in Creed Hollow, 40 miles south, 3 days after the hearing. He hadn't run as far as Gideon had feared. Galt's deputy picked him up at a boarding house where he'd been staying under a different name, which suggested he'd been planning to stay in the region rather than put real distance between himself and whatever came next. That particular detail told Mara something about how certain Rusk had been that the hearing would go his way. He'd kept Sutter close, probably expecting there'd be more work to do. There wasn't. Not the kind Rusk had planned for. Galt came out to Bell Ranch himself to tell her, which she appreciated because it meant he'd decided she deserved to hear it directly rather than through Harmon Briggs or some letter from the county seat. He sat at her kitchen table with coffee he barely touched and laid out what they had. Sutter's real name was Edmund Creel, and he had a history in 2 counties of doing exactly what Gideon had described: land pressure work, property damage, and in at least one case that Galt was now re-examining, arson. The Dalton Springs fire was on that list. "He's talking," Galt said. "Some. Enough." "About Rusk?" "About the arrangement, yes. The canyon enclosure was his setup. Rusk gave him the location and the cattle. He managed the branding and the holding. He'd done similar work for Rusk twice before, smaller scale." Galt wrapped his hands around the cup. "The Dalton Springs fire. He's not admitting to that yet. But the connection is there. We're working on it." Mara looked at the table. "The Hale family's property. That was the target." "It appears so. Gideon Hale's wife died in that fire." She'd known it since the morning June showed her the drawing, but hearing Galt say it plainly was different. It had a weight that knowing privately didn't have. "Does Gideon know officially?" she said. "From you?" "I spoke to him yesterday, before I came here." Galt looked at her steadily. "He took it the way you'd expect a man to take it." "Didn't say much." She nodded. "Rusk is lawyering up hard," Galt continued. "Forsyth brought in 2 more from the city. It'll be a long process. He's got money, and he'll use it." He paused. "But the evidence trail from the canyon goes straight to him. Creel kept records. Mara, the man kept actual written records, dates and payments. I don't know if that was insurance or stupidity." "Probably both," she said. Galt almost smiled. "Probably both." He stood, picking up his hat. "Your cattle will be returned from the canyon within the week. I'll have a deputy supervise the move so the chain of custody stays clean for the legal case." "I appreciate that." He put his hat on and looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something. "You built a solid case, Mrs. Bell. Before I got involved or cared to, I want you to know I recognize that." She met his eyes. "I also want you to know that you were late," she said. "Not unkindly, just you were late, and that's worth remembering for whoever comes after me with a problem like this one." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It is." He left. She sat at the table for a while without moving, and then she got up and went out to find Gideon. He was at the south fence line, which was where he seemed to go when he needed to work through something he couldn't sit still with. She found him replacing a post that had been leaning since before she'd even noticed the fence cuts. Structural wear, not sabotage, just the slow failure of something that had been standing too long without attention. She stood near him without speaking for a minute, watching him work the post into the new dug hole and pack dirt around the base. "Galt came," she said. "I know. I saw his horse. He didn't stop working. He talked to me yesterday." "I know." He was quiet. He tamped the dirt down with his boot heel, testing the post's resistance with both hands. It held. "She never told me," he said. "June. All those months. She was protecting you. She's 8 years old." He said it with a roughness in his voice that wasn't anger at June, wasn't anger at all exactly, more like the sound of something that had been tightly controlled for a very long time shifting against its constraints. "She's 8 years old, and she was carrying that alone because she thought I couldn't handle it." "Could you have?" Mara asked. Not cruelly, just honestly. He looked at her. He thought about it, which she respected. He didn't give her the automatic denial. I don't know, he said. Maybe not then, right after. He picked up another post and set it against the fence rail. She's smarter than I gave her credit for. She's not smarter than you. She just had a different angle on it. Mara looked at the fence line running south toward the canyon. She saw what happened. You didn't. That's not about intelligence. That's about being in the room. He was quiet again. The wind came through the scrub and moved the dry grass along the fence line, and somewhere in the middle pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound that carried easily in the open air. Creel's talking, he said. It wasn't a question. Galt had told him too. Enough. Will it stick to Rusk? Galt thinks so. It'll take time. She looked at the post he was setting. Does it matter to you? Legally, I mean, does it change something if there's a conviction? He thought about that too. No, he said slowly. It doesn't bring her back. It doesn't give June her mother. He pressed the post into the ground. But it changes the shape of the story. Knowing it was deliberate instead of accident, that's different to carry. It's heavier in some ways and lighter in others. She understood that. She thought about Thomas's margin note, South Canyon, Rusk, and the way finding it had changed the shape of her grief. Not easier, different, more accurate to the actual truth of things, which turned out to matter even when the truth was hard. Your contract ends at the end of the month, she said. He went still for just a moment. Then he kept working. I know. The ranch has work through fall, probably through winter. The cattle numbers are going back up when the canyon animals come home, and I'll need proper management through the next season if the lease is going to show real production numbers at the next review. She kept her voice practical, which was how she said things that weren't entirely practical. I'm offering a full year's contract, standard wages, the bunkhouse room with the door for June. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd read the situation wrong. June would want to stay, he said, finally. What does June wanting to stay have to do with what you want? He looked at her. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm telling you the work exists and it's yours if you want it. She paused. I'm also telling you that whatever else might be true, I want you to decide it honestly. Not because you think you owe me something for the hearing, not because you feel like you have nowhere else to go. She held his gaze. Those aren't good enough reasons. He looked at her for a long moment. The post was set, the dirt packed, his hands free. What would be a good enough reason? He said. Wanting to be here, she said. That's all. She turned and walked back toward the ranch. The 21 cattle came home on a Wednesday, moved up the canyon trail by Galt's deputy, and 2 men from the county livestock office, who photographed each animal and documented the brand marks before the move. They came into the south pasture in the late afternoon, uncertain and suspicious the way cattle were, after too long in a confined space, and Mara stood at the gate and watched them come through and felt something settle in her that had been tilted wrong since October. Decker counted them as they passed. 21, he said when the last one was through. Thomas logged 13, she said. 2 seasons worth of calves. He closed the gate and latched it. He was more right than he knew. He was right enough. She looked at the animals spreading into the pasture. He just needed more time. Decker was quiet for a moment. Then, you're more like him than you think. The stubbornness. Thomas wasn't stubborn. He was careful. You can be both. He turned toward the barn. You were both. That's what won. She watched him go and stood alone at the gate in the last of the afternoon light. And she thought about what it meant to be compared to someone you'd loved and lost, and also, in the privacy of your own honest mind, sometimes disagreed with. Thomas had been right about Rusk and too careful to act on it. She'd been too overwhelmed to see what was in front of her, and then found her footing and acted when it counted. Neither of them had been the whole thing. Together, maybe, they would have been closer to enough. But you didn't always get to do it together, and doing it alone, slower and harder, was still doing it. She thought that was something worth knowing, that the incomplete version of yourself, the version that's grieving, that's scared, that doesn't know what she's doing half the time, can still be enough. Not because you're secretly stronger than you thought, the way stories usually went, but because strength isn't a fixed thing you have or don't have. It's something you build in pieces from whatever's in front of you with whoever happens to be standing nearby. Gideon had been standing nearby. So had Decker. So had a child with dark eyes and a piece of burned cedar and 7 months of careful, patient observation stored up inside her like water behind a dam. None of them had saved her. She hadn't needed saving. What she'd needed was what she'd gotten. People willing to stand in the same direction she was standing at the moment she needed them to. She latched the gate and went in for supper. June spoke for the first time in 8 months on a Thursday evening, 12 days after the hearing. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no particular trigger Mara could identify later when she tried to trace it back. They were at the kitchen table after supper, Mara with the account books, June with her drawing paper, Gideon reading something he'd borrowed from the small shelf of books Thomas had kept in the sitting room. The lamp was lit. Outside, the early dark of the canyon country had come down fast the way it did in summer, and the frogs in the low ground near the water trough were going at it with their usual conviction. June set her pencil down. She looked at the drawing she'd been working on. Mara could see it from across the table, though she'd been careful not to stare. It was the ranch yard, the barn, the brand rack on the east wall with its irons hanging. Then June looked at Mara and said, "Is the bell mark going to stay?" Her voice was low and a little rough from disuse, but it was clear. A complete sentence, grammatically intact, delivered with the particular care of someone who had been practicing in her head for a while. Mara set her pen down. Gideon looked up from his book. He was very still. "Yes," Mara said. She kept her voice even, because she understood instinctively that making this into an event would be the wrong move, that June had chosen a quiet moment to say a quiet thing, and the right response was to meet her at that level. "The bell mark stays. It's been on this ranch for 20 years, and it's going to stay." June nodded. She looked at the drawing. "I drew it right then," she said. "Let me see." June turned the paper around. The brand rack was exact. She'd drawn the irons in their positions, including the cracked bell iron with the split running through the bell shape. She'd drawn the crack carefully, not hiding it, not minimizing it. The split was there, clear, part of the design now. "You drew the crack," Mara said. "It's part of it now," June said. "That's what it looks like." Mara looked at the drawing for a long moment. Across the table, she heard Gideon set his book down very quietly and say nothing. "Can I keep this?" Mara asked. June considered it with the seriousness of someone evaluating a real request. Then she nodded and pushed it across the table. Mara took it. She looked at it one more time. The rack, the irons, the cracked bell with its split drawn in careful pencil. And then she got up and went to the small shelf above the desk where Thomas had kept his surveying notes and his seed catalogs and the things he wanted to be able to reach easily. She set June's drawing on the shelf and put a smooth stone from the windowsill on the corner to keep it flat. When she turned back, June was watching her with those dark eyes. Something in her face had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that faces changed when a decision had been made and the weight of carrying it had been set down. Gideon said from the table, without looking at his daughter, "Good drawing, June." Just that. June said, "I know," and picked up her pencil again. It was, Mara thought, the most normal thing that had happened in this house in months, and the normalcy of it was so specific and unexpected that she had to look out the window for a moment until her face settled. The lease papers came from the board office the following Monday, sealed and official, 5 years on Bell Ranch, under the name Maribel Bell, her name only. She signed them at the kitchen table with the same pen she'd used on the account books and the timeline and every document she'd assembled in the weeks before the hearing, and the signature was her usual signature, unremarkable, the same one she'd been putting on things her whole adult life. It felt different this time, not larger, just more accurate. Like the name and the signature and the thing being signed had finally come into full alignment. She put the signed copy in the desk drawer where Thomas had kept the original lease, and she kept the second copy on the table for a moment, looking at it. Gideon appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hand. He'd been doing that less lately. The hat in the hand, the waiting at the door. Mara had noticed but said nothing about it, because some things were better left to sort themselves out. "Papers came," he said, "signed and done." She set the copy on the desk. "I'd like you to stay," she said. "I told you that at the fence line. I'm saying it again now, in a different way." She met his eyes. "Not just as the rancher with the work, as the woman who's been sitting across the table from you for 6 weeks and would prefer to keep doing that." He was quiet for long enough that she felt the familiar uncertainty move through her. Not the old fear, the thing that had made her sharp and careful with everyone since March, but a different kind of uncertain, the kind that came from wanting something and not being sure you'd get it. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I haven't found that to be true. You haven't seen me in winter." "Then stay through winter and show me." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile. More like a smile's quieter relative, the kind that didn't make much noise but meant more. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It wasn't a promise of anything beyond what it was, and neither of them dressed it up as more. That was exactly right. The frontier had a way of stripping the decoration off things and leaving what was real, and what was real between them was simpler than romance and more durable. Two people who had sat across from each other in difficulty and found the other one still there the next morning, and the morning after that. That was not nothing. In Mara's experience, it was most of what mattered. What? The burned cedar piece found its new place on a Sunday afternoon in late summer, when Mara was cleaning the barn and reorganizing the tool wall and generally doing the kind of work that involved touching everything and deciding what was worth keeping and what had outlasted its purpose. June appeared in the barn doorway with the cedar piece in her hands. She'd been carrying it less the past couple of weeks. Mara had noticed it appearing on the bunkhouse windowsill, or on the kitchen table when June wasn't there, as though it was becoming an object in the world, rather than something she needed to hold on to constantly. She walked to the brand rack on the east wall and stood in front of it, looking at the irons. The cracked bell iron was back in its place, the reforged shank holding, the split through the bell design, visible but stable. Then June reached up, she had to go on her toes, and set the burned cedar piece on the narrow wooden shelf at the top of the rack, where the wood was wide enough to hold it flat. She stepped back and looked at it. It sat there above the irons, a piece of a burned house, carrying the mark of people who had done a terrible thing, and also carrying the fact that a child had held it through the worst months of her life, and eventually used it to tell the truth. "You sure about that?" Mara said. June looked at the cedar piece on the shelf, then at the cracked iron below it. "They're the same," she said. "Broken things that are still here." Mara looked at the shelf, at the cedar and the cracked iron beneath it, at the whole rack with its bell irons, used and worn and some of them older than her marriage, marked by years of work rather than display. "Yeah," she said, "they are. June turned and went back toward the bunkhouse with the light step of someone who had set something down and found the load easier without it. Mara stood alone in the barn for a while. The afternoon light came through the high window at the angle it came through in late summer, the particular long gold of it that meant the season was turning, even if the days were still warm. She could hear Gideon in the far pasture talking to Decker about the rotation schedule, their voices carrying without the words being clear, the specific back and forth of men doing practical work with practical language. She could hear the cattle in the south pasture, the 21 returned animals mixed in now with the rest of the herd, indistinguishable from a distance. She thought about Thomas. She did that less often now, which was different from thinking about him less. She thought about him just as often, but the thinking had changed character. He was part of the ranch's history, fully and permanently. The crack in the brand iron was part of the rack's history. The cedar piece was part of what the shelf held now. The past didn't go away. It just became part of the structure, and if the structure was honest about what it was made of, it held better for including it. She thought about the kind of strength that wasn't the obvious kind. Not the dramatic stand, not the moment of confrontation, though those had happened and they'd mattered, but the other kind. The kind that showed up at 4 a.m. to do the account books again. The kind that asked a child what she was drawing instead of telling her not to be underfoot. The kind that let someone else fix the water trough without making it mean something about who was in charge. The kind that said, "I'm not broken, not by announcing it, but by getting up the next morning and working the fence line." That was the thing nobody told you when they talked about frontier women, about women who held their ground. They talked about courage like it was a single event, A moment where something snapped into place and you became the person you needed to be. But it wasn't one moment. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions, most of them unglamorous, none of them observed by anyone who would remember them. It was doing the thing again after you'd already done it twice. It was trusting someone not because you were certain, but because the alternative was certain failure. It was letting June sit by your fire for an hour without asking her to justify her presence. Nobody gave you credit for that kind of thing. And the truth, Mara thought, standing in the afternoon light in the barn, where Thomas's tools still hung in the places he'd left them, was that you didn't do it for credit. You did it because the land needed tending and the cattle needed managing, and the people who had shown up on your doorstep needed somewhere to be. And you were the one standing there with the ability to provide or refuse, and you chose to provide. That was all it was, and it was enough. Eats. That evening, for the first time, 4 plates went on the kitchen table. It happened naturally, without discussion or ceremony. Mara was setting the table and June was helping. She'd started doing that the week before, appearing in the kitchen before supper with the particular purposeful look of someone who had decided to be useful. And June opened the shelf and took out 4 plates without being asked and set them at the 4 places. Mara looked at the 4 plates. At the table that had held 2 people for 9 years and then 1 person for 6 months, and now, by some series of events she couldn't have predicted or planned, held 4. She didn't say anything about it. June set the cups out with the same matter-of-fact competence, and then Gideon came in from outside and Decker came in behind him, and they all sat down to eat. The conversation at the table was not remarkable. Decker talked about the rotation schedule. Gideon mentioned a section of the north fence that would need attention before the first hard freeze. June ate her food and occasionally said something brief and accurate that stopped the conversation for a moment before it continued. Mara listened and contributed and looked at no particular thing for too long. It was ordinary. It was a meal on a working ranch at the end of a long day. The food was decent, not exceptional. The lamp needed trimming. One of the chairs had a wobble that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Ordinary. And underneath the ordinary, something that wasn't ordinary at all. Something that had been built over months of difficulty and honesty and proximity and the particular intimacy of hard work done together. Something that didn't have a clean name but was recognizable to anyone who had ever sat at a table and understood, without being able to say exactly when it happened, that the people around them had become something they hadn't been before. Family was one word. Chosen was another. Neither of them quite covered it, because neither covered the specific texture of people who had found each other not through blood or sentiment, but through necessity, and then, having found each other, had decided to stay. After supper, June took the cedar piece from where she'd left it on the kitchen counter. She'd brought it in from the barn shelf, Mara noticed, and it seemed like it might move between places now, owned by the whole house rather than kept solely in the child's hands. And she turned it over once and set it on the windowsill where the evening light hit it. The burn mark, the brand mark that wasn't a brand mark, the shape that had started everything. It was just a piece of burned wood on a windowsill, which was also exactly what it was. Mara washed the dishes. Gideon dried them, which he'd started doing 3 weeks ago without asking. Decker went out to check the stock before turning in. Later, when the house was quiet and Gideon had gone to the bunkhouse and Decker was in his room, and June was asleep with the door closed, Mara sat at the desk for the last time that day. She pulled out the account books, not to work, just to look at them. At the numbers that made sense now, that added up to something viable, something real. She put them away. She pulled out June's drawing of the brand rack and looked at it for a moment. The careful pencil lines, the cracked iron drawn without apology, the split that was part of it now. She put it back on the shelf and put the stone on the corner. Then she turned down the lamp and went to bed in her house on her land, with the lease signed under her name, and the cattle in the pasture and the brand rack on the barn wall holding every iron that had ever marked a Bell Ranch animal, including the cracked one, including the one that was still good for use. The hard things and the durable things together, holding the shape of something that had been fought for and was still standing. That was Bell Ranch. That was what it had always been, underneath the grief and the fear and the months of not knowing if she could hold it. She had held it, and now she would keep it. She closed her eyes, and outside the window the frogs in the low ground were at it again, and the cattle were settled, and the night was exactly as long as it needed to be before it became morning.